Smith.
And I want to welcome the opportunity given to us by the Social Democrats' motion to discuss this hugely important issue. We recently celebrated with some fanfare 100 years of the anniversary of the Dáil, and I want to start by quoting the statement adopted by the first Dáil 100 years ago. It shall be the first duty of the Government of the Republic to make provision for the physical, mental and spiritual well-being of the children, to secure that no child shall suffer hunger or cold from lack of food, clothing or shelter, but that all shall be provided for with the means and facilities requisite for their proper education and training as citizens of a free and Gaelic Ireland, 100 years ago. It's staggering, the idea that in 100 years or more we have failed so badly. And today, as this motion points out, there are over 200,000 children in poverty, in a total of over 600,000 people in poverty. The first point that I want to make is that the rate of poverty is not an accident or an unfortunate oversight. It is not something, unfortunately, that will be changed by Dáil motions, by reviews, by commissioning reports, by setting targets, or even by convening august bodies of experts to look at the issue. It's systemic, it's ingrained, and it's a wholly foreseen consequence of our economic system and the priorities and the policies it places on that system by this and past governments. It's true that the rates of poverty soared during the last recession, and despite some falls in recent years, there are still more children in poverty now than there were 10 years ago. It's also true that the ERSI warning in July is unfortunately most certainly to come true, that the COVID pandemic and the recession will likely see an increase of anywhere around a quarter of those figures. But the persistent, endemic and extraordinary figures of child poverty are not caused ultimately by one recession or another, but caused by the very structure of Ireland's economic and social fabric. Our industrial, housing, welfare and even climate policy will ensure it remains so. Over 100,000 of those in poverty are working. The working poor, the children of those workers, are living in poverty not because of an oversight, but because we have an economy that encourages low pay, precarious employment with minimal oversight and enforcement around workers' rights and statutory entitlements. We pride ourselves on a voluntarist model of employer-working relations, which is a code for a lack of workers' rights and entitlements enforced by the state. We are a haven for bad employers, and a direct consequence of that system, carefully built up over the decades, is the working poor and their children. So long as the government's primary concern is to sell this country to national and international investors as a low-wage, deregulated economy with little oversight or enforcement on workers' rights, we will continue to see high child poverty rates. Thousands more tonight will be in emergency accommodation, thousands more of those children in poverty, and tomorrow they'll face gruelling journeys to and from school with the impact of not having a stable, secure home. And this again is entirely foreseen. It's a consequence of a housing policy that eulogises the private market and provision of housing, that sees housing as a commodity to make some people wealthy, and the purpose of that is to generate wealth for a few, but not shelter for the many. So as long as we have the system of REITs, vultured funds and the untrammelled rights for landlords, it will continue. As long as the government are more concerned with ending an eviction ban in case it disturbs landlords than it is with providing shelter and secure homes from people, then we will continue to see high poverty rates in wider society. We also know that 12% of our children live in fuel poverty, that some 140,000 homes are cold and damp, and yet we have a climate policy that prioritises individual responsibility as the driver of CO2 emissions, a policy that allows corporate responsibility off the hook, but sees raising carbon taxes on fuel, heating and transport and the needs of ordinary people as a way to change personal behaviour, a policy, in short, designed to fail to limit the CO2 rises and guarantee to keep people in fuel poverty with no alternatives. As long as the government sees carbon tax increases on fuel and heating and the needs of ordinary people as the chief measure needed, we will continue to see high child poverty rates. The slight falls that have been noticed in recent years, I suspect, are being wiped away as we speak, because the COVID crisis down to a large extent the increase in CO2 rates, and then there was a minimal increase in social welfare rates. In one sense, there's no mystery about how to end child poverty if that is your goal. It's entirely possible to target state supports in housing, employment, health and education, and even in climate change, and of course especially in social protection and welfare to make a real impact. But again, we see recent steps and actions by the government that when the chips are down, this is not actually a government priority. What is entirely foreseen consequences of the recent cuts in the PUP payments for over 200,000 recipients, what is the consequences of the cuts in the wage subsidy scheme for another 300,000. These will add to the misery, the difficulty of making ends meet, the worry, the stress and the uncertainty for thousands and thousands, and ultimately will filter out into the statistical increases in child poverty, in fuel poverty, in food poverty. We support this motion, but in the unfortunate certainty that it will have no impact on the lives of those children in poverty tonight, and those who this government and their policies will ensure in the coming months and years will remain the same. To achieve the change, we ultimately need more than a Dáil motion. We need a mass movement of workers, of families, of members of this society who are affected by these headline rates that will force this and other governments to address the deep structural injustices and inequalities ingrained into our economic and social system since the state was founded. 100 years ago, I'll just remind us all, since we discussed similar motions, and we're still at it today. It is systemic, it's endemic, and it needs to be addressed from the bottom up.